So Microsoft is reimagining their Azure Solutions Architect Expert certification. That means there are some changes coming in how you earn that certification. As of now, you earn it by passing 2 exams, the AZ-303 and the AZ-304. Both of these are going away and will be retired on March 31st, 2022. Until that date, you can still get your Azure Solutions Architect Expert certification by passing them, but Microsoft will also open up 2 new paths, one temporary and one that will stick around for the foreseeable future. Check this out. The current path of taking the AZ-303 and the AZ-304 will stick around until they both retire. A new temporary path will open up, and that is to take the AZ-303 exam and then take the AZ-305 exam once it's available. A new, more permanent path will be to earn your Azure Administrator Associate certification, which you get by passing the AZ-104 exam, and then pass the AZ-305 exam once it's available. These 3 paths will earn you the Azure Solutions Architect Expert certification, but as I said, both the 303 and the 304 will be going away, so that leaves the AZ-305 exam the only way to get that certification. So let's check out what the AZ-305 exam is all about, shall we? As with the AZ-700 video I did a little while back, I'll leave some links down in the description as resources for you to check out. I'll refer to YouTube videos and docs pages throughout this video, and they will all be linked down in the description. I wouldn't be surprised if those help out more than this actual video, so don't miss them. Also, like, comment and subscribe if you want. Alright, now let's start by comparing the AZ-305 with the good old AZ-303 and the AZ-304. If we take a look at the skills measured section of the 305, we see that it has a lot in common with the AZ-304. That makes a lot of sense, considering that one of the new paths to Azure Solutions Architect Expert will be to pass the AZ-303 exam and then pass the AZ-305 exam, at least until the 303 exam retires. So if you've been studying for your AZ-304 exam, you can use a lot of that knowledge to pass the AZ-305 exam. You will not have studied in vain. The AZ-305 exam will test your knowledge in 4 main areas: design, identity, governance and monitoring solutions, design data storage solutions, designing business continuity solutions, and finally designing infrastructure solutions. 3 of these areas are weighted the same, 25 to 30%, while designing business continuity solutions will be weighted at only 10 to 15%. So let's dig a little deeper into the first main area here, designing identity, governance and monitoring solutions. According to the skills outline from Microsoft, there are 4 parts you need to be able to design: logging and monitoring solutions, authentication and authorization solutions, governance, and finally identity and access for applications. For logging and monitoring, you need to be familiar with Azure Monitor and setting diagnostic logging settings on app services and basically any other service in Azure. You also need to be able to recommend an appropriate level of logging and recommend a monitoring solution, in which you basically only have Azure Monitor and Azure Sentinel to choose from. I guess that you're probably comfortable with this already, but I would suggest you head on over to the docs pages and have another read through, especially the Azure Monitor logs overview and the how-to guides on setting diagnostic settings. When it comes to authentication and authorization, you need to know how role-based access control works for Azure resources and how to find out what type of access a user has to Azure resources. You should also know about managed identities and system-assigned identities, how they work, and a little bit about just-in-time access. The biggest part here will probably be a couple of Azure AD features, namely the Azure ID Identity Protection and Azure AD Privileged Identity Management, or PIM. You should also know how to do access reviews in Azure AD. So check out the docs pages for identity protection. Kevin Brown has an excellent video on PIM, and John Savill has a deep dive on access reviews, so check those out. For governance, you need to be able to design and recommend hierarchies for Azure resources. Things like management groups and management areas will be key parts here. But don't forget Azure policy, which is a huge part of governance in Azure. You need to know what it is, what it can do, and you need to be able to create and manage policies. A huge resource here is John Savill's masterclass on governance. It covers a lot of the governance parts of Azure, including RBAC, management groups, Azure policy, and more. Link to it is, of course, down in the description. The last part of identity governance and monitoring is identity and access for applications. Here you need to know about how to use applications in Azure AD to access Azure resources, how to register applications in Azure AD, and how to control how your users are providing consent to these apps. This also means that you should know about managed identities and how to use single sign-on to third-party apps through Azure AD. In the requirements for this part, it's also stated that you need to be able to recommend a solution that securely stores passwords and secrets. So get to know Azure Key Vault. So great resources for this part is the video on managed identities from Adam Marchak and John Savill's deep dive on the Azure Key Vault. Now for the second of the main area, designing data storage solutions. And there are a ton of ways to store data in Azure with services like Azure SQL Database, Cosmos DB, MariaDB, Data Lakes, and Azure Files, and so on. And because of that, I doubt that Microsoft will go into depth on all of these. Either way, this area consists of 4 main parts, and that is data storage for relational data, data integration, data storage for analysis, and data storage for non-relational data. Data storage for relational data is about 3 main things: sizing your Azure database services, scalability, and encryption. You should know what options you have around sizing your Azure SQL databases and the different service tiers you have. That can be knowing when to use general purpose, when to use hyperscale, and when to choose DTU-based sizing over vCore-based sizing, and so on. To cover the scaling part, you need to know about the differences in scaling depending on what service you choose. For example, if you want the DTU-based one, you cannot do that with a managed instance. It would also help if you knew about alternative scaling methods like database sharding. And around encryption, it's basically a knowing about how Azure encryption works and the fact that transparent disk encryption, or TDE, is a thing for Azure SQL. Around data integration, it's not a whole lot in the skills outline. It's basically just 1 bullet point stating recommend a solution for data integration. So get to know Azure Data Factory, Azure Databricks, Azure Data Lakes, and Azure Synapse. Reading up on the basics of these services should suffice for this part, or you can just watch John Savill's walkthrough on these services. I believe it's called Understand Where Azure Data Services Fit in Your Data Flow, or something like that. I'll have a link for it down in the description. Data storage for data analysis is where you need to know how to store relational data, non-relational data, and semi-structured data. This means knowing the basics of Azure SQL Database, Azure Database for MariaDB, PostgreSQL and MySQL, Azure SQL Managed Instance, and SQL on a virtual machine. That's for the relational data. For the non-relational data and semi-structured data, you have Cosmos DB, of course, but you also have services like HBase in Azure HD Insights, table storage, blob storage, and data lakes. If you know the differences in between these services, you should be good to go. Last part of the data storage solution is the data storage for non-relational data. Here you need to be able to balance feature, cost, and performance when choosing a solution. Also know about access controls to your data storage and how to design your data for protection and durability. So read up on core Azure storage service, the daily lake storage, and find out which service is best in each case, learn how to protect them and how to select the different levels of durability, and learn how resource locks work, soft delete, snapshots, and so on. John Savill has an excellent masterclass video on databases that will cover most of the things you need to know in this area, and if you combine that one with his video on how Azure Data Services fit in your data flow, you should have pretty much covered this area of the exam. Now for the smallest of the 4 main areas of the exam, at least in terms of weight, and that is designing business continuity solutions. There are only 2 main parts here. You have backup and disaster recovery, and you have designing for high availability. Under the backup and disaster recovery part, you are expected to know what recovery options are available for Azure services, for hybrid solutions, and for on-prem workloads. You should know what your options are in recovering container services, and you need to be able to recommend recovery solutions for compute, database, and unstructured data. Azure Site Recovery and Azure Backup are 2 key services here. You get to know them in detail. get to know how to use them to replicate VMs within Azure or from your Hyper-V or VMware servers, and know how to back up VMs and databases. There are a ton of videos out there on how to replicate VMs within Azure, but unfortunately not a whole lot on how to replicate VMs from your on-prem environment up to Azure. So for site recovery, you should start by reading up on the docs pages around that service. For Azure Backup, you can check out Dean Safolow's video playlist over on the Azure Academy channel on YouTube. When it comes to high availability, you should know about availability zones and what services you can use them with. You should also know about what other availability options you have for VMs and how to configure them. Check out John Savill's video on availability zones to learn more. In addition to that, you should know how to set up your databases and storage accounts for redundancy and availability, especially storage accounts, Cosmos DB, Azure SQL Database, and SQL Managed Instance. To cover most of that, check out episode 45 to 56 of the Azure SQL for Beginners playlist that Microsoft Developer has on their YouTube channel. The link to that playlist is of course down in the description. And finally, we have the last of the 4 main areas, and that is design infrastructure solutions. They have also split this area up into 4 main parts, and that is compute solutions, application architecture, migrations, and network solutions. The first one requires you to be able to recommend a VM-based, container-based, or serverless-based solution, and sizing that compute environment based on workload requirements. Now, VM-based will primarily be virtual machines, but be aware that you might get some questions around Azure Virtual Desktop here. So this is probably the only time I will shamelessly plug one of my own videos, so check out my video on what AVD is if you want to. Container-based solutions could be Kubernetes, of course, but also Azure App Services and Azure Container Service. Probably also a good idea to know more about the Azure Container Registry. And for serverless-based solutions, I would expect there will be full focus on Azure Functions. To cover this, it would be a good idea to check out John Savill's masterclasses on containers and on application services. And for Azure Functions, you can check out Adam Marchak's tutorial on Azure Functions. In the application architecture part, there's a lot to consider. You need to know about caching solutions, messaging architectures, event-driven architecture, automated deployment solutions, application and configuration management, and API integrations. For caching, you have the Azure CDN, of course, so read up on that, but also read up on Azure Front Door and Azure Cache for Redis. For messaging and event-driven architectures, I expect there to be a focus on Event Grid and Event Hub, as well as Service Bus. So read up on those and see how you can combine their powers with things like Logic Apps and Azure Databricks. I believe Cloud Lunch and Learn has a nice session on this, so check out their video on it on YouTube. With regards to automated deployment solutions, I expect there to be a focus on Microsoft's own tools like ARM templates, desired state configuration, Azure Custom Script Extension, DevOps, and Azure Automation. But there might also be notions of other solutions like Terraform, Ansible, Chef, and Puppet. Not sure if Bicep will be mentioned here just yet, but it will probably be here in the future. Learning about these tools plus Azure Automation State Configuration will also prepare you for the application configuration management part. And there are a multitude of videos on this subject, so I'll just leave a couple of links down in the description for you to check out. For API integrations, there's really only one product as far as I know, and that's the API management service. So read up on that, I guess. Next up is migrations, and here you first and foremost need to know Microsoft's Cloud Adoption Framework. This is something that will probably come up multiple times throughout your exam, so get to know it. I'll leave a link to its docs page and Azure Academy's video on it down in the description. For migrations, you also need to be well versed in the Azure Migrate service and how to migrate VMs and databases to Azure. It will also help you if you know a little bit about the Azure Databox service. Checking out John Savill's video on migrating to Azure will really help you along here. The final part that the AZ-305 will test your skills in is within network solutions. Here you need to be able to design networks based on workload requirements, how to optimize network performance for applications, how to optimize network security, and you need to be able to recommend connectivity solutions that connect Azure to the internet and on-prem, as well as recommending load balancing solutions. So take a look at the Azure Networking Architecture documentation for covering that first part, and read up on Azure Firewall and Azure Front Door, as well as VPN gateways and ExpressRoute to cover the connectivity parts. John Savill recently did a deep dive video on Azure Firewall, so that should be pretty up to date. I've previously mentioned a video from Azure Academy on Azure Front Door, and Guide to Cloud has a good video on VPN gateways covering stuff from the AZ-104 exam, but that should be relevant here as well. So check them out, they are of course in the description. As for optimizing network performance, Microsoft has a pretty good guide on that, so read it, go through it, and learn it. The next optimizing we need to cover is network security. And a lot of the services that I mentioned previously in this video can of course help with that. But in addition to those, you also have these guys. NSGs, Web Application Firewall on Azure Application Gateway, Azure Bastion, Azure Security Baseline for virtual networks, Application Security Groups, and Azure DDoS Protection. Links to these and resources around them is, you guessed it, down in the description. The last thing on our list to cover is recommending a load balancing and routing solution. Here you need to know about, of course, Azure Load Balancer, but also about the Azure Front Door service, Traffic Manager, Azure Route Server, and the generic routing tables. At this point, you're probably familiar with the Azure Front Door service, but make sure you understand how it can be used to route traffic to different regions based on where requests are coming from, and so on. The Azure Load Balancer should be familiar territory from the AZ-104 exam, but I believe the Traffic Manager was left out there. Thankfully, the Azure Traffic Manager is a pretty basic service, so skimming through the docs page and trying out a lab or two should suffice. And that leaves us with the Azure Route Server, which is a fairly new service. And to understand how it works, it would probably be a good idea to understand a little bit about how BGP works, since that is basically what it does. A tip here would be to check out John Savill's video on the Azure Route Servers, because that also covers a little bit about how routing works within a VNet. And that's it. That's all the stuff you need to learn in order to pass your AZ-305 exam. If I missed anything, or if you have any feedback or questions, feel free to leave them in the comments and I'll reply to them there. And good luck to you on your exam, and I'll see you in the next one. See ya!